Hey there. Tonight, I want to begin with a small object that sits very quietly behind glass, while around it the museum air stays cool and still, as if even the dust has agreed not to disturb what is written there. It is only a clay prism, not especially large, not flashing with gold or jewels, not the sort of thing a hurried visitor would cross a city to see, and yet its surface is crowded with tiny wedge marks, pressed by a patient hand so long ago that the mind almost pulls away from the number. Those marks say that rule itself came down from the sky, that a flood erased one world and selected another, and that certain families carried the right to command across the ruin. If that kind of deep old mystery is the sort of thing you like to fall asleep to, then a quiet like and subscribe would help this little firelit corner find the next restless listener. Now settle in, loosen your shoulders, let your jaw soften, and take one slow breath as if the room has grown larger around you. There is no need to hurry. The clay has waited 4,000 years. It can wait a little longer for us. Picture the prism first, not the claim, not the argument, not the strange man on later screens insisting they have solved everything by lunchtime. Just the object. Baked clay the color of dried earth after heat. 4 sides. Dense columns. About 8 inches tall. You could almost miss it if you were distracted by brighter treasures nearby, which is somehow fitting. Honestly, I have always found it strange that the things with the darkest shadows are often the ones that sit most modestly. A crown dazzles, a sword catches light, a tablet of kings merely waits. The prism was excavated near the ancient city of Larsa in southern Iraq, and now rests in Oxford, where shoes whisper across polished floors and soft light falls on glass. If you were standing there with me, you would probably lean closer at once. Not because the clay is beautiful in the usual sense, though it has its own stern beauty, but because you would feel the pressure of intention in it. Someone wanted this to last. Someone decided that names and reigns and succession mattered enough to be pressed into permanence. That matters more than it may seem. The people who made this list were not casual dreamers tossing legends into the dark for amusement. The Sumerians counted everything. Barley, sheep, oil, labor days, field boundaries, rations. They were the kind of people who turned grain into numbers and numbers into control. Writing itself, in its earliest shape, was bound up with keeping track of things that mattered. So when such a civilization chooses to record a line of rulers, city after city, king after king, family after family, it is hard to shrug and say that none of it means anything. Perhaps some of it is embellished. Some scholars certainly argue that perhaps some of the oldest numbers are encoded rather than literal. It is debated, but the tone of the document is still important. It does not sing. It does not pray. It lists. And the first claim is the one that keeps the whole room cold. Kingship descended from heaven. Not a king was favored. Not a ruler was blessed. Not a priest had a dream. Kingship itself descended. The institution, the right, the authority, the thing behind the throne. It is phrased like movement, like transfer, like an item brought from one realm to another. I know that many historians would urge caution here, and fair enough. Ancient language often bends toward the sacred. But even so, there is something unnerving in how matter-of-fact the line feels. The old scribes do not seem excited by it. They do not decorate it. They simply place it at the beginning, as if no other beginning would do. Then the list starts. Eridu first. A city of reeds and water and first things. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then the names come, one after another, with reign lengths so enormous that most modern readers stop there and laugh a little, or else close the book with the comfortable relief of dismissal. 28,000 years. 36,000 years. 43,000 years. The numbers swell so far beyond ordinary human life that they seem to step out of history and into dream. And yet the old list keeps going with the composure of an accountant. That composure is part of the mystery. If you and I made up a tale to impress strangers, we might pile the numbers high and leave them shapeless, all chaos and exaggeration. But the numbers on the king list are not random. They fall into patterns. They move in mathematically structured ways tied to the Sumerian counting system. That does not prove they are literal. It does prove they are deliberate. Deliberate changes the feeling of the room. Suddenly, the document is not a child pretending to be ancient. It is an adult setting down something according to rules we may no longer fully understand. So before the flood, there were 8 kings, each ruling from old cities whose names now feel half-drowned themselves. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Uruk, Sipar, Sharupak. Their reigns stretch backward into impossible time like shadows at sunset. We can take those lengths 3 ways, at least for now. Maybe they are symbolic numbers encoding something other than years. Maybe they refer to institutions, titles, or dynastic spans later read as individual lifetimes. Or maybe, and this is the option that makes rational people clear their throats and reach for a brighter lamp, our understanding of the earliest human past is thinner than we like to admit. I am not asking you to believe the wildest answer. Not tonight. I am only asking you to stay with the list a little longer. Because then comes the line that changes everything. Then the flood swept over. It is amazingly brief. That is part of its force. No theatrical build. No thunder rolled across the mountains. No lamenting chorus. Just the catastrophe laid down as if it were another entry in the ledger. One world, then water, then another world. Now here is where the old clay suddenly touches real ground. Archaeologists digging in Mesopotamian cities found flood layers, thick sterile deposits of river silt lying between human occupation levels. Below the flood, tools, pottery, ordinary life. Then the silt, mute and clean, as if the world paused and held its breath. Above the silt, life again, but changed. Different sequence, different phase. Not proof of a global deluge. No. There is no good geological case for that. But a catastrophic regional flood in southern Mesopotamia, that is not fantasy. That is mud in the ground. That is river memory hardened into evidence. You know that feeling when a story you thought was safely distant suddenly touches something physical? A shard, a layer of ash, a wall. It changes the temperature of the whole thing. The flood in these traditions is no longer just a large, dramatic splash from a much later imagination. Somewhere in the old alluvial plain, water really did rise hard enough to divide memory into before and after. And after it, the list says something even stranger. Kingship descended from heaven again. Again. The same institution. The same authority. The same motion from above to below. It did not merely continue. It returned, or was restored, or re-entered the world through a second descent. However one chooses to read it, the text insists on continuity between the old order and the new one. The flood did not invent kingship. It interrupted it. Then the thing was reintroduced. I have always found that more eerie than the flood itself. Water destroys. Water is easy to imagine. But the return of authority from the sky, a second granting, a second transfer, that belongs to a colder category of thought. It suggests selection. It suggests that catastrophe did not flatten the hierarchy, but refined it. After the flood, the center shifts to Kish, the first post-flood city of kingship. The reigns are still impossibly long by our standards, but they are shrinking. 1,200 years. 900. 600. The pattern moves downward, as if whatever the earlier rulers possessed is fading, or being diluted, or measured differently. If this were pure invention, one might expect later dynasties to keep the grand old scale and flatter themselves with it. But the numbers contract. They come closer to ordinary human limits over time. That decline is one of the quiet details that refuses to leave me alone. It feels like a memory of loss. Not only a lost world, but a lessening. As though the kings after the flood inherit a right they no longer hold in full strength. As though something in the blood, or the office, or the contact between heaven and earth has thinned. That idea becomes more unsettling when we begin to see how obsessed these dynasties were with genealogy. Not just who ruled, but whose son he was, whose daughter married whom, which city inherited legitimacy from which earlier line. If power were simply about force, then victory in battle would settle the matter. Yet again and again in the ancient Near East, conquerors do not merely defeat older dynasties. They marry into them. They claim connection to them. They preserve their records. They act as if authority must be inherited, not just seized. And that is how the story begins to thicken around the number 12. 12 major post-flood dynasties, emphasized again and again as the lineages that mattered. Not every city, not every ruler. The dynasties that became anchor points, remembered with unusual care, cited by later kings, folded into the logic of legitimacy. 12 is already a charged number in ancient systems. 12 months, 12 divisions of the sky, 12 gods in structured pantheons. Maybe that is coincidence. Maybe it is architecture. Either way, the number stands in the candlelight like a set of pillars. Before we name them, it helps to understand what they believed they were carrying forward. Not merely a throne, something inherited. The language of divine ancestry in Mesopotamian texts is often more physical than modern readers expect. Not only chosen by the gods, not only beloved of the gods, begotten by, seed implanted by, blood mixed with clay, fractions of divinity assigned to heroes. Gilgamesh, in later tradition, is 2/3 divine. That is such a precise absurdity that it becomes almost more unnerving than a simple miracle. 2/3, not infinitely holy, not mysteriously touched. A ratio, as if divinity were measurable, transferable, something that could thin out over generations the way color fades in dyed cloth left under harsh sun. It makes you wonder what the scribes thought blood really carried. Of course, there are safer interpretations. Maybe all of this was metaphor for status and sacred office. Maybe bloodline was social theater, nothing more. Maybe, but if so, it was theater so consistent, so bureaucratically preserved, and so tightly linked to succession, marriage, priesthood, and law that it began to behave like a governing technology, a system. It was not merely sung by poets. It was managed by archives. And archives have a way of making even legends feel heavier. Imagine those temple rooms for a moment. Shelves of tablets, dust in corners, reed baskets, clay tags, scribes sitting with bent backs and careful fingers. Outside, donkeys, market noise, heat on brick. Inside, the hush of recorded inheritance. One tablet logs barley, another logs labor, another lists the family that holds a temple office, another marks the succession of a ruler whose ancestor was said to stand nearer to heaven than common men. The same hands preserve all of it. The same schools train the scribes. The same impulse governs the work. Record what matters. Preserve what grants order. If you were a later conqueror walking into that world, you might smash a statue. You might burn a gate. But if you wanted to stay, really stay, you would need more than victory. You would need a story of legitimacy. Better still, you would need a marriage contract. That is why the thread does not end in drowned Sumerian mud. It keeps moving. Through Kish and Uruk, through and Lagash, through Akkad and III, through Hittites and Trojans and Roman claimants, through medieval chroniclers who dragged ancient names across vellum with the same stubbornness that old scribes once pressed wedges into clay. You can dismiss any single step if you like. Many historians do. But the repeated shape of the thing remains. Powerful families do not like to imagine themselves accidental. They like dissent. They like continuity. They like to stand in a hallway of portraits and feel that their faces were waiting there long before they arrived. And if the first line of that hallway is really in southern Mesopotamia, on a clay prism with 4 sides and 400 lines, then the whole matter becomes very difficult to tuck away politely. So let us not tuck it away. Let us stay a little longer with the first post-flood stillness, with the mud drying, with the old world underwater and the new one emerging in careful entries. Kish first, then other cities, then the branching of power into those 12 remembered dynasties. We are about to begin naming them, and once we do, the story will stop feeling like a misty legend and start feeling more like a family archive with a curse folded into it. The flood has passed. The clay is drying. The names are waiting. The first city after the water is Kish. That is how the list wants us to begin again. Not with a hero on a mountain. Not with birds returning to a roof beam. Not with a rainbow over receding water. But with administration. A city. A sequence. A line resumed. There is something almost chilling in that. The flood has done its work. Swallowed houses. Bent reeds flat into mud. Left boats where courtyards used to be. And what returns first in the text is government. Order. Succession. The old human instinct to say who rules and why. Kish was not the only city in southern Mesopotamia, but in the King List it becomes the first post-flood seat of authority, as if history itself climbed out of the water there and wrung the river from its sleeves. We know Kish was real. Its ruins still sit in Iraq. Archaeologists found massive mud brick remains there, traces of power thick enough to reassure even the most skeptical mind that these were not ghost capitals invented for a tale. Kish had walls. Kish had kings. Kish had the practical heaviness that myth usually envies. The first ruler, named after the flood, is difficult to know in any intimate way. Many of the early names come down to us with damage, uncertainty, and long echoes of language. But that uncertainty is not emptiness. It is more like looking at a face through smoked glass. You cannot make out every feature, yet you know someone is there. And then one name sharpens. Etana. If you were standing here, with me by the fire, I would probably smile a little at this point, because ancient power is always trying to look severe. And then, suddenly it gives us a story so wonderfully human that the whole grand machine wobbles for a second. Etana, according to later tradition, cannot produce an heir. There it is. All the talk of heaven and kingship and post-flood authority, and in the middle of it sits a household problem, old as grief. No son. No continuation. No certainty that the line will survive one more generation. That is the first thing I want you to notice. The story is not primarily about wisdom or conquest. It is about keeping the bloodline alive. Etana does not journey toward the divine realm to become more enlightened in any broad philosophical sense. He does not ask for hidden geometry or the names of stars. He wants the plant of birth. He wants continuation. The tale says he is carried upward by an eagle, rising toward heaven in one of the oldest strange ascent scenes ever written down. And even if we read it as myth, the pressure underneath it is not mythic at all. It is dynastic panic. A ruler who believes legitimacy is inherited cannot simply shrug and let the family line break. No heir means more than personal sorrow. It means a crack in the architecture of order. So in the house of Kish, the question is not who is strongest. It is who is born correctly. From Kish, the thread moves to Uruk, and here the old record begins to feel suddenly familiar because Uruk gives us one of the most famous names in all ancient literature, Gilgamesh. But before Gilgamesh, there are others, founders, builders, men who belong partly to history and partly to story because the ancient world saw no need to divide those things as sharply as we do. Enmerkar, associated with the building of Uruk. Lugalbanda, the shepherd king who later acquires a glow of semi-divine memory around his name. And then Gilgamesh, the king whose grief, pride, rage, and fear have made him strangely easy to feel across thousands of years. The line about Gilgamesh is the one people always remember. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. That fraction sits in the mind like a splinter. If the text had called him simply blessed, we might pass over it. If it had called him beloved of the gods, we would nod and move on. But 2/3, that is not devotional language in the ordinary sense. That is accounting language smuggled into myth. It behaves less like incense and more like inheritance law. Part this, part that, a being composed of measurable proportions, as if holiness could thin or thicken in the line the way land is divided among sons. His father, in later tradition, is the human or semi-divine king, Lugalbanda. His mother is Ninsun, a goddess. So the hero stands at the seam between human and divine, which also means between mortality and something that resists it. And that is the heart of Gilgamesh. Really. Not just adventure, but a crisis of blood. He is too exalted to be ordinary, and too human to escape death. His body carries enough of the higher world to hunger for permanence, and enough of the lower to rot. After Enkidu's, Gilgamesh does not simply mourn a friend. He encounters the limit of his own bloodline. All his grandeur, all his city walls, all his strength, and still his body is moving toward dust. So he goes in search of the flood survivor, the one who crossed catastrophe and was granted something beyond normal human ending. In the Akkadian tradition, he becomes Utnapishtim. In the Sumerian line of thought, he echoes Ziusudra. Different names, same cold desire. To find the one man who got through the bottleneck and came out not merely alive, but altered. That matters immensely for our story. Because once again, the deepest longing is not conquest, but continuity beyond decay. The post-flood world seems to remember the pre-flood world as a place of longer life, stronger contact, closer access to divine status. Gilgamesh is haunted by what he almost is. The old greatness is near enough to torment him and far enough to remain unreachable. The list itself keeps moving, calm as ever. From Kish to Uruk, from Uruk onward. But if we slow down and listen, what we hear beneath the names is the same anxious music. Maintain the line. Confirm the descent. Protect the legitimacy. Make sure the right blood survives into the next generation. It is so consistent that after a while it no longer feels like literary flavor. It feels administrative, like the dark, soft center of government. Then we come to Now the room changes again. Is not only a name on a prism. It is a place where earth opened and gave back a cemetery so rich, so still, and so troubling that even now the imagination slows when it enters. Excavators uncovered royal tombs there in the early 20th century, and what lay inside was not vague majesty, but concentrated hierarchy. Gold helmets, lapis lazuli, harps, fine cups, seals, bodies placed with ceremonial care, and around some rulers, attendants arranged in death as if service itself had crossed the threshold with them. It is one of those archaeological moments that refuses to stay tidy. You can describe it with the polite, dry words of a report. Grave goods, retainers, elite burial practice. But if you linger in the chamber for even a minute in your mind, the scene becomes much stranger. Quiet bodies laid down in order. Jewelry catching what little light enters. A ruler in the center, as if gravity itself belongs more to that one body than to the others. Queen Puabi is the name that drifts through this stillness most vividly. Her grave goods are famous, and there is something almost unbearable in the delicacy of them. Beads, gold leaves, blue stone, ornaments made for a living body now turned into an emblem of rank in death. Was she loved, feared, revered, used? We cannot know. The bones tell one kind of truth, the objects another, and between them lies all the usual human darkness. What matters for this investigation is not any single romantic story we may invent around her, but the pattern of treatment. The rulers of were not buried as successful administrators. They were buried as beings set apart. The resources devoted to them, the sacrificial logic surrounding them, the preservation of their names, all point toward a society that believed hierarchy had metaphysical depth. These were not merely richer people. They were thought to belong to a different category. That category is where bloodline enters again. A dynasty can only command this kind of obedience if people believe its central body matters beyond politics. Not just because the ruler has soldiers. Not just because the ruler controls food. Those things matter, yes. But this feels deeper. If attendants truly followed rulers into death, whether willingly or under ritual pressure, then they were responding to more than law. They were responding to a system that taught them that proximity to a royal body mattered even after life was over. Now, I do not say this lightly. Ancient evidence is rarely as transparent as modern people want it to be. We must be careful. We cannot overhear the private thoughts of the dead. But even caution has to admit the emotional scale of the tombs. Something about royal blood was being staged there in a way common blood was not. If Kish gives us the reestablishment of kingship, and Uruk gives us the arithmetic of semi-divinity, then gives us the material theater of sacred rank. And all the while the family logic tightens. Sons succeed fathers. Brothers step in when sons are too young or weak or absent. Daughters marry outward to secure alliances while still carrying the line into new places. Temple offices remain within connected households. Power does not drift randomly through the population. It follows channels, like irrigation water cut into earth long before dawn. That is why later dynasties, even when they overthrow earlier ones, so often try to anchor themselves in what came before. You can seize a city quickly. A pedigree takes longer. And in these ancient systems, pedigree seems to have mattered as much as armies. Imagine an old archive room in at the end of a hot day. Outside, the baked mud bricks still holding sunlight. Inside, a scribe dampening a lump of clay, rolling a cylinder seal, checking a father name against a previous record. The room smells of dust, oil, reed fiber, and old cool earth. Somewhere nearby, someone is counting rations. Somewhere else, a priest is preparing offerings. In another room, a family is discussing a marriage that must happen, not because two young people are smitten, but because a line must hold. It is almost funny, in a bleak way, how often the fate of civilization seems to depend on who sits where at supper and whose daughter is promised to whom. No wonder ancient kings liked to dress all this in sacred language. It sounds better to say heaven arranged it than to admit that empires may hinge on in-laws. But sacred language and family strategy are not opposites here. They are braided together. That is what we are beginning to see more clearly now. The 12 dynasties are not merely 12 names to recite for atmosphere. They are the skeleton of a system. Kish restarts the office after the flood. Uruk intensifies the claim through figures like Gilgamesh, whose lineage is described in partially divine terms. Stages the social consequences of believing that some bodies are born nearer to heaven than others. The pattern does not yet need to be proved in some final modern way to become interesting. It only needs to be observed honestly. And honest observation leads to an uncomfortable place. Because once bloodline becomes the logic of rule, marriage stops being private. Birth stops being private. Even grief stops being private. Every cradle in a royal house becomes political. Every stillbirth becomes a dynastic event. Every heir becomes a vessel loaded with more than human expectation. That is why the old stories keep returning to fertility, to succession, to divine parentage, to miraculous births, to journeys undertaken for heirs. It is not narrative decoration. It is the system confessing what it values most. I have always found that sad. Behind all the grand stone and bronze and ceremony, there is a family trapped inside an idea. Rule must continue. Blood must continue. Heaven touched us once, and the touch must not fade. That is a lonely burden to place on a child before he can even speak. And yet that loneliness is part of what gives the old king lists their peculiar emotional power. They are so dry on the surface that the deeper fear leaks through indirectly. The fear of breakage. The fear that the line will fail. The fear that once the remembered blood thins too far, kingship itself may become merely human. Maybe that, more than anything, explains the obsession with preserving records. If your authority depends on descent, then memory is infrastructure. Forget a grandfather, and you weaken a throne. Misplace a marriage tablet, and you blur a claim. Lose the archive, and a rival may rewrite the line. So the names are pressed, copied, stored, repeated in inscriptions, folded into hymns, bound to temple offices, recarved on monuments, spoken over tombs. The same impulse that kept the prism alive also kept the dynasties alive in the imagination of those who followed them. And that is precisely why the story becomes more dangerous as it continues. Because the dynasties do continue. Not in one smooth, unbroken fairy tale. No. History is too messy for that. Cities fight. Families fracture. New powers rise. Outsiders conquer. Yet even the outsiders so often bend themselves toward the old logic instead of throwing it away. They do not merely say, "We won." They say, "We belong. We descend." We are linked. We have married in. We hold the right line now. That is where this whole night journey is taking us. Out of the first post, flood cities and into a wider field of dynasties. Priest kings, conquerors, and claimants, each trying to stand under that first unnerving sentence and make it theirs. Kingship descended from heaven, not only to us perhaps, but through us now, through our house, through our children, through our seals and contracts and graves. The fire is lower now in my mind, and the old cities feel closer. Kish behind us, Uruk breathing through its walls, shining faintly in the dark, like buried gold under dust. Ahead wait Lagash and Akkad, priest kings and empire builders. Men who will not be content merely to inherit heaven, touched blood, but will start announcing themselves as gods in public. And once that begins, the night grows stranger. The next faces in the old procession belong to cities that did not merely want to inherit authority, but to embody it so completely that the line between temple and throne began to blur into something almost seamless. Lagash is where that blur becomes hard to ignore. If Kish feels like restoration, and Uruk feels like inherited strangeness, and feels like rank made visible in death, then Lagash feels like administration draped in incense. Warm clay, lamp oil, the faint mineral breath of carved stone. This was a place where governance and devotion leaned so closely against each other that they nearly cast one shadow. The rulers of Lagash did not present themselves as ordinary managers of land and grain. Their inscriptions return again and again to divine favor, divine selection, divine planting, as if rulership were not a social accident, but a cultivated line grown under the eye of a god. One ruler in particular stands in that candlelight with unnerving calm. Gudea. His statues survive in unusual numbers, and that already tells you something. 27 carved bodies still seated, still standing, still holding their clasped hands in that posture of pious concentration. He appears patient in stone, almost humble at first glance. But the quieter the image, the more carefully you have to listen. Gudea presents himself as a devoted servant of Ningirsu, the patron god of Lagash. He dreams. The god reveals. The ruler obeys. Materials are gathered from far regions. Cheddar, stone, metals, everything needed to rebuild the temple according to divine instruction. The temple is not just a building project. It is proof of alignment, proof that heaven still communicates with the right bloodline through the right body. Gudea is not merely paying respect to the divine realm. He is demonstrating that his household stands in direct continuity with it. The dream does not fall on a random passerby. It falls where legitimacy is already assumed to belong. I have always thought dreams are a wonderfully convenient place for power to hide its paperwork. A ruler wakes, announces that the god has spoken, and suddenly stone from distant mountains must start moving. Still, even here, the language keeps circling back to family, to house, to lineage. Divine favor rests not only on a single man, but on the house from which he comes. That is one of the oldest patterns in the whole story. The chosen are rarely chosen alone. Their households become the vessel. Their descendants become the archive. Their marriages become policy. Lagash also gives us another revealing phrase in the inscriptions of an earlier ruler, Eanatum, who is described as seed implanted by the city god. That expression is not airy. It is biological sounding. Seed. Implanted. It suggests an image of rulership as something inserted into a line, carried forward in the body, not merely conferred from outside like a robe thrown over the shoulders. That matters because once bloodline is described this way, the whole political structure starts behaving like a breeding program with liturgy wrapped around it. Marriages become barriers against dilution. Temple offices become hereditary property. The ruler is no longer merely a man who happens to control the granaries. He is a vessel of continuity. And if one city can claim that, another city must answer it. So beside Lagash stands Umma, rival and mirror. Their disputes over borderlands and canals were not just ordinary land quarrels, though of course they were also that. Water is serious business in southern Mesopotamia. A field without irrigation is a prayer with no reply. But the inscriptions make clear that conflict between cities also carried a theological dimension. Each side claimed divine sanction. Each side treated territory as something rightfully held under sacred approval. The gods are drafted into every land dispute. One ruler invokes his patron deity. The rival answers with another. The borders of irrigation channels become the borders of heavenly preference. Yet even the warfare reveals the same deep structure. You do not just win land. You prove bloodline. You prove that your city, your ruler, your ancestral line remains closer to the original source of kingship. Then comes Akkad. And with Akkad, the old regional tension swells into something larger. Sargon rises like a disruption in the records, the sort of figure history always produces when a system is stable enough to be worth seizing. His origin story has the shape of myth, hidden birth, lowly upbringing, sudden ascent. Whether every detail is factual is almost less important than what Sargon does once he has power. He does not abolish the old legitimacy framework. He enters it. That is important. If a man truly believed kingship were only a matter of force, then, after conquering the older cities, he could simply declare himself master and be done with it. But that is not how Akkad presents itself. Instead, the new power takes hold of existing sacred language, existing cities of prestige, existing titles, existing family frameworks. Sargon seizes power, yes, but then wraps himself in continuity. He is not outside the order. He is its renewal, or its correction, or its rightful concentration. This instinct to step into the old current rather than replace it becomes one of the clearest signs that bloodline claims mattered more than mere victory. The conqueror still wants pedigree, whether by marriage, ritual, office, or story. And then Sargon's descendants begin saying the quiet part louder. Naram-Sin. He is one of those rulers who turns inherited logic into explicit declaration. Earlier kings claimed divine descent, divine favor, divine planting, divine selection. Naram-Sin edges closer to a simpler, more dangerous sentence. I am divine, not merely associated with sacred power, identified with it. His monuments show him wearing the horned crown that had been reserved for gods in Mesopotamian art. That detail matters deeply. Symbols do not drift casually in such systems. A crown shape is classification. Put it on the head of a king, and you are not just flattering him. You are redrawing the line between categories. Some later traditions treated this as arrogance, and perhaps it was. But I suspect it was also the logical endpoint of the bloodline system when handled by a sufficiently confident dynasty. If a royal house spends generations insisting that legitimacy is inherited through divine descent, then sooner or later someone in that house will look in the polished metal and say, "Perhaps I am not merely descended from the divine. Perhaps I am close enough to count." The old records of Akkad also remind us that empire intensifies genealogy rather than softening it. Sargon's daughter, Enheduanna, is not simply a royal woman tucked away in a side room. She is placed in high religious office. A priestess. A bridge. Her role ties Akkad to older centers of prestige and worship. Suddenly the empire is not only politically expansive, but genealogically strategic. Bloodline and temple are being braided more tightly. No wonder the archives cared so much. No wonder names were copied and recopied. Because empire does not survive only through walls and spears. It survives through marriages, through wombs, through pacts made in rooms heavy with incense and account tablets. And if Akkad shows us the bold face of imperial bloodline logic, the fall of Akkad shows us how fragile even that boldness is. Empires crack. Drought comes. Rebellion steers. Peripheral peoples press inward. The Gutians descend from the Zagros, and the old scribes describe them with all the warmth of a man forced to share a bed with winter. Barbarians. Chaos bringers. Men without proper restraint. You can hear the city mind recoiling. But what interests me most is not the hatred. It is the way even these outsiders are handled by the records. They are included. Their kings are listed. Their hold on power is acknowledged, however reluctantly, yet the memory of their rule remains unstable, contested, almost allergic to legitimacy. Why? Because conquest alone did not satisfy the system. The Gutians could hold territory, but they did not fit easily into the old bloodline story. They could seize a palace, but a seized palace is not the same as inherited authority. Unless they married in, adopted ritual forms, or attached themselves to surviving lines. They remained foreign to kingship as Mesopotamia wanted to understand it. Rule without pedigree felt temporary. This is one of the clearest clues in the whole investigation. If all this divine ancestry language were merely decorative, then successful conquest should settle everything. Yet it does not. The old system keeps asking the same question. From whom do you descend? Not merely, who do you command? Eventually the answer, at least for a time, comes with the third dynasty of Ur. And here the whole machine reaches an almost frightening perfection. Ur the Third is bureaucracy, with sacred blood pulsing through it. Archives from this period are astonishing in scale. Grain, textiles, livestock, labor, silver, 2 rations, deliveries, appointments, offices, everything recorded. And nestled inside that administrative blizzard are the royal family records, The succession logic, the tracking of sons, daughters, marriages, provincial assignments, dynastic continuity. Urnama founds the dynasty. Shulgi follows him. Amar Sin. Shu Sin. Ibi Sin. The line moves father to son, brother to brother when needed, all within the same family. No wandering improvisation. 100 years of concentrated continuity, documented with the same care applied to barley rations and livestock transfers. That equal treatment is what I find so revealing. The same state that records sheep records heirs. The same scribal schools that track work gangs track daughters married to governors. The same clay that preserves tax obligations preserves bloodline. This is governance, confessing that bloodline is one of its core resources. Shulgi, in particular, becomes almost luminous in the official material. Royal hymns praise him with language edging again into divinity. He is not merely favored by the moon god. He is begotten by the moon god, so the texts say. Again, we are back in the strange grammar of inherited sacred substance. If kingship came from heaven, perhaps in the correct line, heaven still circulates in the flesh. Some scholars would urge caution here, and rightly. Royal texts flatter. They magnify. True enough. But ideology repeated this consistently across legal, ritual, genealogical, and artistic form starts to feel like more than flattery. It becomes social reality. People marry according to it. Succession follows it. Offices depend on it. Wars are justified through it. And all the while, the old pattern of strategic marriage continues. Royal daughters marry governors and elites in key cities. This is usually described as alliance building, which is correct, but not complete. It is also bloodline distribution. A king's daughter does not simply calm a province. She extends the house into it. Children born of such unions carry royal ancestry into local administration. After a few generations, the empire becomes a web of related households. Not everyone is a king, but many important people are tied by blood, however diluted, to the same central line. The effect is subtle and powerful. It makes rebellion more complicated. It also means that when the dynasty falls politically, its bloodline does not vanish. It remains scattered through marriages, offices, temple households, regional elites. A throne can collapse in a month. A family network lingers for centuries. That lingering is one of the reasons the story continues at all. Because, by now, we can see that the 12 dynasties are not 12 isolated episodes. They are a breeding architecture of legitimacy. Some rise brightly. Some fade faster. Some leave more stone. Some more tablets. Some more legend. But together they build a world in which authority is inherited substance, documented obsessively, guarded through marriage, and made visible through ritual. When later powers arrive, they do not step into empty ground. They step into this architecture. Imagine now the palace after sunset. Sand cooling outside the walls. Lamps burning low in administrative rooms. Somewhere a clerk still smoothing damp clay with the side of his thumb. Somewhere A woman of the royal house, listening to older women, discuss a marriage she will enter not for affection, but for continuity. Somewhere, a boy who has been told all his life that he is descended from something higher than ordinary men, and who has begun to believe it enough that his own reflection already feels like an obligation. This is how ancient structures survive, not only in battles and monuments, but in those softer rooms, in the private training of children, in the careful narrowing of marriage circles, in the polished repetition of origin stories until they become more solid than brick. No wonder later conquerors found the system useful, because a framework that teaches people that some families are supposed to rule is too valuable to discard if you can insert yourself into it. And that insertion, that great westward and outward drift of sacred legitimacy, is where the night is leading now, through the collapse of one line into the claims of another, through Hittites and Babylonians and all the restless inheritors who understood that power grows colder and stronger when it can say, not merely I won, but I descend. The statues of Gudea keep their folded hands. Naram-Sin still stands beneath his horned crown. The archives of still murmur with marriages and heirs. And somewhere in the old dark between city and desert, the bloodline system is preparing to leave Mesopotamia without ever really leaving it behind. Once the dynasties of southern Mesopotamia had taught the old lesson properly, that authority belongs most securely to those who can wrap it in ancestry. It was never likely to remain confined to one patch of river mud. Ideas travel. But more than ideas, families travel. Sometimes they travel in triumph, mounted high behind armies and scribes and wagon trains loaded with bronze and grain. Sometimes they travel in ruin, under smoke, carrying the names of the dead and a few surviving contracts tied up in cloth. Sometimes they travel through marriage so quietly that the map barely notices. A daughter leaves one court, enters another, and generations later, an entire royal house behaves as if it had always belonged to both places. That is how the ancient world spread its most enduring habits. By the time we move beyond the core Sumerian cities and into the broader Near Eastern field, the bloodline system is no longer just a local obsession. It has become the grammar of legitimacy. Babylon inherits it. Assyria sharpens it. The Hittites adapt it. Persia absorbs it. Each civilization gives the old structure a new costume, but the body underneath keeps the same posture. Rule is hereditary. Rule is sanctioned by more than force. Rule belongs to houses, and those houses must explain where their right began. Take Babylon. By the old Babylonian period, the southern plain had already endured enough collapses and renewals to make any simple story impossible. Cities had risen. Dynasties had thinned. Rival powers had crossed and recrossed the same ground. And still the logic remained. Hammurabi is remembered now for law, for those carved steles and that stern image of orderly justice. Yet even his authority did not float free from the old system. He did not rule as an isolated genius who made legitimacy out of nothing. He inserted himself into the deep line of Mesopotamian kingship. That is what the great rulers nearly always do. They present conquest as continuation. The law code begins by grounding his authority in divine commission. The god has chosen. The ruler has been called. Justice is not personal preference. It descends from a higher source and is administered through the correct king. Different language from the old prism, perhaps, but the underlying form feels familiar. Human power is safer when framed as inherited or bestowed from above. A city may obey a strong man for a while. It obeys much longer when convinced the strong man stands inside a cosmic line. By Assyria, the whole thing grows harder, sharper, and more imperial. The kings of Assyria were masters of terror in the public sense. Reliefs show sieges, captives, ranks of soldiers. All the polished brutality empire prefers to call order. But even there, behind all the military noise, sits the old genealogical calm. Assyrian kings state their fathers, grandfathers, ancestors. They build annals not only of victories, but of descent. The throne is not merely seized, it is inherited correctly, or at least presented that way. I sometimes think this is one reason dynastic politics can feel so ghostly. Armies make the visible noise, but ancestry is the quieter force underneath. The Hittites show this especially well. Here the trail begins to move toward the western lands that so many later noble families would claim as their bridge to antiquity. Anatolia becomes a hinge. The Hittites borrowed myths, rituals, legal forms, diplomatic language, and all the little devices by which kings make themselves seem inevitable. The important point is that they also entered the marriage web. Royal houses do not merely exchange gifts. They exchange daughters. That is how old systems cross frontiers. A treaty is impressive. A child born of two dynasties is more durable. Tablets from the Bronze Age world preserve these alliances in all their dry glory. One royal house binds itself to another. A princess goes east. Another goes west. A treaty is sealed not only with words, but with wombs. It is one of history's least romantic and most consequential truths that empires are often joined together by women who had no real choice in the matter. So when later traditions claim that power in Europe traces back through Trojan, Anatolian, or Eastern lines, we should not immediately wave the whole thing away as embroidered fantasy. Some of it certainly is embroidered. Medieval chroniclers could decorate a genealogy until it looked like a chapel ceiling. Still, the mechanism itself is ancient and real. Bloodlines did move through diplomacy. Legitimacy did move through marriage. Records do survive, showing ruling houses stitching themselves together across language and geography. Troy sits in this story like a bright knot. There it is, half history and half memory, too famous to trust easily and too well-rooted to dismiss entirely. Archaeology confirmed that there was indeed a city there, layered through destruction and rebuilding, standing where trade, ambition, and war would naturally gather. Hittite texts refer to powers in that region. Greek tradition turns the place into an immortal wound. And later Rome, needing Old Glory almost as badly as it needed Rhodes, reaches back and claims Trojan descent. That is the moment where the thread becomes difficult for modern minds, because we are trained to sort things neatly. Historical city, literary epic, political propaganda, family myth. In reality, these categories bleed into one another. What matters is not whether every named ancestor in a later royal family tree would pass modern documentary standards. What matters is that the claim of Trojan descent became politically useful because it connected later elites to a zone already saturated with ancient prestige and already tied through the Hittite and wider Near Eastern worlds to the older language of heaven sent kingship. The Romans understood this very well. They were magnificent borrowers. They took gods and law and architecture and rhetoric from conquered or admired peoples, then spoke of them as if they had been waiting in Rome all along. Trojan ancestry served this instinct perfectly. Through Aeneas, Rome could be old, noble, wounded, chosen, and connected to the heroic collapse of a world before its own. Better than that, it could claim not only antiquity, but sanctioned antiquity, a line that had survived catastrophe and crossed sea and fire into a new destiny. And once Rome adopts it, later Europe inherits not just roads and administration, but a genealogical mood. You can see it centuries later in medieval chronicles that insist great houses descend from Trojans, from ancient kings, from figures who themselves stood closer to some sacred or heroic source than ordinary men. Frankish lines claimed ancient Eastern origins. British lines would later be threaded through Trojan or quasi-divine northern figures. Scandinavians developed their own migration memories, linking exalted ancestors to lands to the south and east. Are these traditions exact historical reporting? No. But are they random? Also, no. People in power do not usually fabricate their ancestry in arbitrary directions. They fabricate, exaggerate, or preserve in the direction that prestige already points. And for centuries, the direction of prestige pointed back toward the ancient Near East, toward old city-states, flood survivors, divine houses, and the first heavy civilizations that had already decided bloodline was the shape of authority. There is also the matter of continuity in institutions. Temples become churches. Sacred kings become anointed monarchs. Divine descent becomes divine right. The language changes as religions change, but the old bone structure remains. A ruler is not only the winner of a contest. A ruler is the proper vessel, the correct family, the line through which heaven, providence, destiny, or sacred order chooses to act. I have always found it slightly amusing that political theology changes its wardrobe more often than its habits. Put the same old instinct in different robes, and it still wants genealogy, ceremony, and a child waiting in the next room. The Persian world offers another revealing transformation. When Cyrus takes Babylon, he does not stride in as a man eager to erase all that came before. Quite the opposite. He presents himself as a restorer, chosen by the city's own god to put things right. That tells you everything. Even a conqueror as successful as Cyrus does not feel safe ruling Mesopotamia by naked foreignness. He must become legible inside its older legitimacy framework. He honors temples. He uses familiar, sacred language. He behaves like a successor, not merely an invader. That is a confession of the system's strength. The same thing happens again and again. Successor kingdoms in the Hellenistic world commission native priests and scholars to translate old histories into new languages. Why preserve king lists, flood memories, genealogical logic, and sacred histories if brute occupation is enough? Because occupation is never enough for long. Later ruling houses need more than obedience. They need metaphysical paperwork. The old records cross into new languages. Ancient dynastic memory enters the Mediterranean mind in a fresh form. Once the stories and legitimacy structures of Mesopotamia become available to Greek-speaking elites, they join the larger stream that eventually feeds Roman, Christian, medieval, and early modern genealogical imagination. The line stretches. The names change. The pulse remains. By the time we reach medieval Europe, the whole thing is dressed in velvet and heraldry instead of clay and cuneiform. But the family instinct has not altered much at all. Houses document descent with manic care. Marriage among elites is tightly managed. Claims to ancient origin are polished, copied, corrected, and weaponized. The great families do not merely want wealth. They want oldness. They want to feel as though they did not arrive, but continue. That craving for continuity is one of the most revealing human habits of all. New money may be tolerated. Old blood is revered. And because old blood is difficult to prove, families build archives around it. Genealogical trees, seals, chronicles, legal confirmations, church records, funeral monuments, heraldic symbols. All the paper and stone needed to make memory behave like evidence. The modern world likes to imagine it outgrew this, but I am not sure it did. It may have simply traded crowns for boards, courts for conferences, royal marriages for elite social networks and educational pipelines. The names of institutions changed. The concern with pedigree did not vanish. Yet we are not ready to stand in the modern glass towers just yet. We are still moving through the old corridors, following the bloodline logic as it survives each collapse by changing form faster than the states that carry it. And collapse keeps coming. Cities fall. Dynasties fail. Harvests shrink. Armies burn archives. New kings rise. Yet each new order reaches backward for legitimacy the way a drowning hand reaches for a root in the riverbank. It wants continuity. It wants to say, not only we have power, but we have the right kind of power. Inherited, recognized, sanctified. That is why the flood story mattered so much in the first place. Not merely because of water, because it created a bottleneck, a narrowed point through which authority could be purified, reset, and then claimed by a smaller number of surviving lines. The world before the flood becomes vast, semi-divine, half-lost. The world after the flood becomes selective, controlled, documented. The right families survive, and all later rulers must relate themselves to those families somehow, by descent, by ritual, by marriage, by adopted myth. That gives later genealogies their peculiar chill. They are not only family trees. They are declarations of survival after judgment. No wonder later nobles loved them. No wonder royal houses fought so hard over succession. If your bloodline is not simply old, but post-catastrophe chosen, then every cousin marriage, every disputed child, every carefully arranged union begins to feel like the maintenance of a sacred reservoir. It sounds dramatic, but listen to the behavior rather than the rhetoric, and you start to hear it clearly. Families that truly think ancestry matters act in certain ways. They document, they restrict. They arrange. They preserve. They become quietly fanatical about memory. Imagine now a long chain of rooms across centuries. A Hittite archive room. A Greek-speaking court with Babylonian texts being rendered into a new tongue. A Roman house where ancestry to Aeneas is discussed as if it were a civic asset and a family devotion all at once. A Frankish monastery where a chronicler bends over vellum, making sure the line reaches Troy. A later noble library where family trees unfurl like vines over generations of names. Different lamps. Different gods. Different scripts. Same instinct. Do not break the line. Do not lose the claim. Do not forget where authority began. And perhaps most important of all, do not let the children marry too far outside the circle. There is a dark comedy in this. Human history is forever pretending to be about ideals while constantly negotiating over cousins. But the comedy only makes the pattern more human, not less real. As the night deepens, the old prism in Oxford begins to feel less like an isolated artifact and more like the first visible knot in a thread that crosses empires. The clay sits still. The thread does not. It pulls through Anatolia, through Troy, through Rome, through medieval bloodlines, through every later family that found power safer when wrapped in remembered descent. The real question now is what happens when this ancient genealogical mood meets the modern age, with its banks and boardrooms and official disbelief in sacred blood, while still somehow preserving all the old habits of elite continuity. That is where we are heading next. Out of the ancient courts and into the colder rooms of modern power, where names are still inherited, marriages still noticed, and ancestry still handled with a care that ordinary people are told no longer matters. Mesopotamia behind us, but not gone. Hittite tablets cooling in the dust. Troy burning and surviving in story. Rome collecting ancient prestige the way a rich man collects old marble. Medieval houses dressing bloodline in saints and heraldry. All of them, in their own way, still listening for that first sentence. Kingship descended from heaven. And once you have heard it enough times, it becomes difficult not to notice who still behaves as if some families are closer to the echo than others. By the time the story reaches the modern age, it acquires a new costume, but not, I think, a new heart. The old crowns are still there in some places, polished, photographed, waved at from balconies. But in many of the rooms where influence gathers now, the symbols look less theatrical. Dark suits, conference badges, family offices hidden behind discreet names, foundations that sound charitable, banks that sound neutral, schools that sound meritocratic. The language becomes cooler. The bloodline logic does not entirely disappear. It simply learns how to speak in a lower voice. This is where many people become uneasy, and I understand why. Ancient kings are easy to place at a distance. A horned crown on a stone relief feels safely remote. But a modern family that still tracks ancestry, still marries within certain circles, still appears generation after generation near the centers of finance, politics, culture, and power, that feels much closer to the skin. It is one thing to hear that a ruler of claimed divine descent. It is another to wonder whether the descendants of later elite houses Houses who officially laugh at mysticism in public still behave in private as if pedigree were a kind of invisible currency. Now, let us be gentle here, because this terrain attracts feverish thinking. Fever is not useful tonight. We are not building a frantic little tower of accusation. We are following a pattern, and patterns become interesting not when they prove everything, but when they survive repeated chances to disappear. The pattern is simple enough to say, powerful families document themselves. They marry with care. They preserve access. They hand influence to children with the same steadiness ancient dynasties handed temple offices to sons. In the modern world, this process is often hidden under kinder words. Education, opportunity, family tradition, stewardship, networking, legacy. None of those words are false. Exactly. They are just soft blankets laid over a very old frame. Take royal houses first, because they remain the easiest to see. The surviving monarchies of Europe no longer command empires as they once did, but they retain something subtler and, in some ways, more durable. Social centrality, ceremonial prestige, interlocking kinship, vast inherited memory. If you map the marriages of modern royalty across the last few centuries, what you see is not random romance skipping freely through the population. You see a circle, a widened circle sometimes, certainly, yet still a circle. Certain schools, certain noble houses, certain approved families, certain notions of suitable background, even when the modern press calls a marriage fresh, normal, unexpected, you often find, after a little patient looking, that it remains much less random than it first appeared. The accents may differ. The bloodline logic often does not. And this should not surprise us. Royal houses were never merely emotional units. They were repositories of continuity. Their job was not only to survive, but to remain themselves recognizably enough that the public could project permanence onto them. You cannot do that if ancestry means nothing. So ancestry is kept alive, first in archives, then in habits, then in the instincts of children raised to understand that every introduction carries invisible context. The same holds true in aristocratic families that no longer rule openly. Titles may fade in legal significance, but family memory does not fade nearly so quickly. Estates, trusts, land holdings, philanthropic boards, discreet advisory roles, old schools, diplomatic circles, private clubs. All of these allow continuity without spectacle. A family does not need a throne if it still sits at the junction of money, reputation, and access. I have always found it strange that modern societies insist bloodline no longer matters while maintaining entire industries devoted to pedigree. Genealogists, family offices, exclusive schools, legacy admissions, society pages, private archives, heraldic institutions. One begins to suspect that the public rejection of ancestry and the private management of ancestry are simply two halves of the same modern trick. Then come the great banking families and industrial dynasties, which fascinate people precisely because they seem to offer a secular version of royalty. No crown, no coronation, no palace ritual, and yet the same old smell of continuity. Money replaces temple grain. Board seats replace priestly office. Foundations replace shrines. Family names keep reappearing in the accounting of power. Some of these families began with commercial brilliance. Yes, that should be granted. Not every old name was born under carved ceilings. Some rose through ferocious talent, timing, and discipline. But here is the interesting part. Once wealth reached a certain scale, it almost always began to behave like bloodline wealth. It became hereditary. It became protected. It became marriage conscious. It sought alliance with older names. It purchased not merely assets, but belonging. New money, if it wishes to become old money, must marry history. And history, when it opens the door, usually demands offspring. This is why so many supposedly modern power centers begin to resemble the older dynastic world once you wait long enough. The first generation builds. The second generation stabilizes. The third begins to collect legitimacy, art, titles, properties, board positions, elite educations, and strategic marriages. Before long, the family no longer looks like an accident of commerce. It looks like a house. That word matters. A house, not just a surname with a balance sheet, but a lineage. The structure begins to feel almost Mesopotamian in spirit. Keep the wealth in the line. Place children in key roles. Bind allied families through marriage. Build public sanctity through philanthropy. Maintain archives. Teach descendants who they are. And that final step may be the most important of all. Teach descendants who they are. Because a bloodline system survives only if children inherit not just assets, but self-understanding. They must grow up breathing the family story so deeply that they mistake it for atmosphere. The old houses knew this. The modern ones know it too. A child raised among portraits, stories of ancestors, institutional connections, and careful expectations does not move through the world the same way as a child raised among only immediate concerns. Legacy changes posture. It changes confidence. It changes how risk is perceived. It changes who seems like us and who does not. This is one reason elite education matters so much. Schools that gather the children of the influential are not simply academic factories. They are sorting houses, meeting grounds, marriage markets delayed by a few years, places where one generation quietly recognizes the next. The old royal court has become more distributed. That is all. It now stretches across campuses, internships, family foundations, think tanks, diplomatic receptions, and boardrooms. Here, too, the language remains cooler than the reality. Talent is discussed. Excellence is praised. Merit is sung over and over. Some of that is true, yet if you look closely, you often find that talent enters through a gate already shaped by ancestry. Not always, but often enough to preserve the pattern. And then there are the private gatherings, the elite conferences, the discreet councils where political leaders, financiers, media figures, strategists, royal representatives, and inherited wealth keep encountering one another in person. Publicly, these are networking spaces, discussion forums, policy environments. In practice, they often function like modern assemblies of connected houses. Nothing supernatural is required to make this significant. Human beings coordinate more easily when they already trust each other, and trust is accelerated by shared background, repeated contact, and generational familiarity. If you were standing here with me, beside the fire, you might say, yes, but that is just class reproducing itself. And perhaps, in the most cautious framework, that is exactly what it is. But even that cautious answer still leaves us with something remarkable. Class reproducing itself across centuries begins to look very much like the old dynastic instinct under a less honest name. The more daring interpretation would go further. It would ask whether some elite families think of their continuity as more than social, whether they privately believe there is something in the line itself, not merely in the money, not merely in the schooling, but in the blood, perhaps not divine in the old explicit sense. Modern people dislike sounding ancient in public. Still, one can imagine a private language of superior stock, inherited capability, family quality, breeding, temperament, resilience, destiny. The words change. The old confidence remains. And then, like a cold finger at the edge of the page, genetics enters the room. Now this is where many stories become clumsy, because they reach for certainty where only suggestion exists. We should not do that. Ancient DNA studies, population analysis, and haplogroup distributions do show broad patterns of migration and ancestry. Near Eastern ancestry moved westward over long periods. Bronze Age elites were not genetically identical to every ordinary population around them. Ancient movement into Europe through Anatolia, the steppe, and the Mediterranean is real. That much is solid enough. What becomes more uncertain is the interpretive leap. Does the presence of certain ancient ancestry patterns in later elite families prove a direct and carefully preserved line back to the old Mesopotamian dynasties? No, not prove. It suggests continuity is plausible. It suggests later genealogical claims were not fabricated from pure air. It suggests that stories of Eastern origin, however embellished, may preserve kernels of real movement, real alliance, real inherited difference in elite strata. That is already interesting enough, without forcing it into a fever dream. Some scholars would rightly say we are dealing mostly with elite migration and social closure. Conquering or ruling groups often preserve distinct ancestry for a time because they intermarry among themselves. Of course they do. That explanation is rational, grounded, and sufficient for much of the pattern. Yet the older, darker possibility remains, resting beside it like a second candle. What if some families, at least historically, did believe their line carried more than status? What if that belief shaped their marriages so intensely that even as religions changed, nations changed, and political systems changed, the marriage instinct remained? Protect the line. Keep it close. Dilute cautiously. Preserve something, even if its exact nature can no longer be spoken plainly. This is where royal cousin marriage, aristocratic consolidation, and the discomfort around marrying too far beneath rank begin to look slightly different. Not nobly, not romantically, almost anxiously, as if behind the velvet and protocol there lingered an old fear that too much mixing would dissolve the very thing that made the line worth defending. I do not say that fear was justified, only that it may have been real, and real fear, passed quietly through generations, can shape history more effectively than philosophy ever does. Imagine a family dining room in the 19th century. Candles low, silver catching the warm light. A grandmother, speaking of a suitable match, not in crude terms, never crude. In terms of character, family, stability, shared understanding. One hears only manners on the surface. Underneath is the old command: keep continuity. Do not gamble the line on novelty. Now imagine the same instinct a century later. In gentler modern language, shared values, similar background, a family that understands our world. It sounds so reasonable. It is reasonable. That is why the old systems endure. They rarely survive by sounding monstrous. They survive by sounding prudent. This is also why outright conspiracy explanations often miss the deeper truth. There need not be a single dark room where all major families gather beneath one mural and agree on the fate of nations. Human beings do not need that level of theatrical coordination to reproduce old hierarchies. Shared assumptions do much of the work. Elite children raised in similar environments make similar choices. They trust one another. They marry within overlapping worlds. They enter the same institutions. They inherit the same fear of falling. The network maintains itself because its members experience preservation as normal life, not as conspiracy. And still the old symbolic echoes remain difficult to ignore. Ancient kings wore visible marks of divine relationship. Modern elites wear the subtler marks of inherited belonging. Ancient priestly families held temple offices through bloodline. Modern influential families hold foundation chairs, trust, control, board seats, diplomatic routes, and prestigious educational pipelines through bloodline. Ancient dynasties documented genealogy beside grain and livestock. Modern dynasties document genealogy beside holdings, property structures, titles, and legacy institutions. Nothing is identical. Yet enough rhymes that the ear cannot quite dismiss the song. There is one more thing to notice. Public democratic culture often pretends that each generation starts fresh. But the actual organization of power looks far less fresh than that. The surnames change slowly. Influence is sticky. Certain families remain near the top not because the world is frozen, but because inheritance compounds in hidden ways. Not just money, reputation, relationships, knowledge of how to move, knowledge of whom to call, knowledge of how institutions really work. The unwritten map. That unwritten map may be the most practical modern version of ancient sacred blood. Not magical, not alien, but potent. Something passed down that gives descendants a measurable advantage while remaining frustratingly hard to quantify in public. And once again we return to the old question. Is that all this is? A social and historical machine built from inheritance, marriage, discipline, and class memory? Or is that explanation itself only the visible layer over something older, stranger, and more biological than respectable modern people prefer to say aloud? I cannot answer that with certainty, and neither can anyone honest. What we can say is simpler, and perhaps more unsettling for being simpler. The old bloodline consciousness never truly vanished. It changed its manners. It moved indoors. It learned to wear modern clothes. And now, as the fire settles lower and the room grows softer, we are ready to ask the final question. Not whether the ancient dynasties existed, not whether later families claimed descent from them, not whether elite marriage networks persist, but what all of this means. What are we actually looking at? Myth, dressed as continuity. Continuity dressed as class. Class dressed as destiny. Or destiny itself, still moving quietly through certain names. That is where the night turns now, inward and colder, toward interpretation, toward doubt, toward the three doors that have waited behind the whole investigation from the beginning. There are, I think, 3 doors standing at the end of this corridor. We have been walking toward them all night without quite touching the handles. Behind each door lies a way of reading the same evidence. The prism, the king lists, the flood layers, the royal tombs, the temple archives, the marriages, the myths, the later noble genealogies, the modern elite networks. None of it changes as we move from one door to the next. Only the meaning shifts. This is why the subject keeps its hold on people. The facts do not settle themselves into a single obedient shape. They remain like lamplight on water, stable enough to see, unstable enough to trouble. Behind the first door lies the most cautious reading. In that room, the ancient stories are political myth dressed in the garments of religion. Kingship descending from heaven is a sacred way of saying that the institution of rule was justified from above, not literally delivered as an object or a blood substance. The impossible reign lengths before the flood are symbolic numbers, coded grandeur, sacred mathematics. The flood itself preserves memory of real regional catastrophe. Yes, but the genealogical claims that follow are mostly elite propaganda built upon that memory. In this reading, later families across the ancient and medieval worlds copied, embellished, and defended prestigious lineages because pedigree stabilizes authority. No more is needed. Human beings who want power create stories explaining why their power is rightful. They trace themselves to heroes, gods, survivors, founders, and ancient capitals because legitimacy is stronger when wrapped in antiquity. It is a sensible room. Nothing supernatural is required there. No ancient hidden science. No non-human blood. No secret priestly code continuing in modern boardrooms. Only political utility, social closure, and a great human appetite for noble storytelling. This reading explains much. It explains why royal houses across cultures generated divine ancestry claims. It explains why medieval chroniclers were so eager to link patrons to Troy, biblical figures, or noble Eastern origins. It explains why modern elites preserve genealogy as symbolic capital. Family trees become expensive theater, Endogamy becomes class anxiety. Private schools become gatekeeping in respectable dress. Honestly, this first room is attractive because it keeps everything on familiar ground. It allows us to remain calm. Human beings invented stories, then believed them, then built institutions to preserve the stories, and those institutions hardened into inherited power. No mystery beyond sociology and imagination. But the longer one sits quietly in that room, the more a few details begin tapping at the door. Why such obsessive documentation if the bloodline idea were only decorative? Why the careful continuity of parentage in societies that could easily have made broader, vaguer claims? Why the mathematically strange fractions of divinity, as with Gilgamesh being 2/3 divine, which sound less like poetry and more like a civilization trying to describe inheritable difference with the wrong scientific vocabulary? Why conquerors so often stepped into old genealogical systems instead of simply discarding them? Why royal marriage strategies remained so restrictive, even at severe biological cost in much later periods? If ancestry were merely theatrical, the first room remains possible. It is serious. It deserves respect. Yet it leaves a residue of unease. So we open the second door. In that room, the atmosphere changes, though only a little at first. The gods need not be gods in any supernatural sense. The bloodline claims may preserve memory of something more historical and less cosmic, an earlier advanced population, perhaps not modern in the industrial sense, but more organized, more mathematically capable, more administratively powerful, more technologically sophisticated than the populations around them, survives catastrophe, and becomes the nucleus of later rulership. Now the old phrases begin to read differently. Kingship descended from heaven could mean that authority came from outside the ordinary human communities of the plain, perhaps from mountain refuges, from surviving centers of knowledge, from a people elevated physically or culturally and thus remembered as sky-linked. Divine blood becomes the memory of ancestry from this advanced group. Long antediluvian reigns become either encoded dynastic spans or the exaggerated memory of a former order whose scale dwarfed later generations. The flood becomes a real bottleneck that preserves only a few key lineages, who then spread power through controlled marriage and inherited administrative skill. This second room feels less mythic and, in some ways, more haunting. Because now the stories are not merely invented, they are distorted memory. The gods are not necessarily gods at all. They are the survivors of a world mostly lost, interpreted by later peoples through sacred language because no other language was available. In this reading, elite lineages may indeed preserve something real, not cosmic essence, but inherited advantage, education, disease resistance, temperament, cognitive specialization, or the simple but enormous power of belonging to a family that always remained one generation closer to administration than everyone else. A line of old competence can feel divine to those outside it. This room explains other things more comfortably. It explains why so many ancient texts sound procedural instead of purely poetic when describing creation, selection, or sacred lineage. It explains why later elites protected bloodline not because they were preserving magic, but because they were preserving a historically successful package of inherited advantage. It explains why genetic echoes of Near Eastern ancestry might remain concentrated in certain elite groups, not because the blood was divine, but because conquest, migration, and social closure kept it from dispersing entirely. And still, after a while, this second room also begins to feel incomplete. Because the old texts do not merely say certain families were more advanced. They say the blood mattered. They say divine and human natures mixed. They quantify divinity. They describe creation through blood and clay in a manner that feels uncomfortably physical. They keep returning to the idea that rulership is not merely taught, but carried. One can translate all this into memory of an advanced human caste. Yes, but one is still translating. One is still politely reducing the strangeness of the original language into something modern minds can touch without flinching. Then there is the third door. It is the one people most want either to fling open or nail shut. Behind it lies the most literal reading, or at least the least embarrassed by literalism. In this room, the ancient writers were not speaking only in metaphor, and not merely preserving broken memory of a superior human caste. They were trying, with the language available to them, to describe actual mixing between ordinary humans and beings they considered non-human or more than human. Divine blood was blood. Inherited essence was inherited essence. Controlled marriage preserved something real in the line, whether biological, metaphysical, or both. In this room, the creation accounts read almost like damaged technical memory. Blood mixed with clay. A worker race fashioned deliberately. Certain lines retaining stronger concentration of the original essence. The flood functioning as selective preservation. Later dynasties obsessing over genealogy, because the genealogy tracked not merely prestige, but substance. It is a difficult room to enter without losing balance, which is why I think people either rush through it in excitement or refuse to go in at all. The strengths of this reading are obvious. It takes the ancient claims seriously on their own terms. It explains why bloodline would matter so intensely, why cousin, marriage, and dynastic closure persisted, why later elites might keep genealogical archives with the seriousness of legal instruments. It makes sense of the fractions, the physical language, the repeated insistence that authority came down from elsewhere and was carried forward in certain families. It also has obvious weaknesses. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and proof of that kind is exactly what we do not possess. No preserved non-human body in a museum basement. No uncontestable biological signature labeled divine. No tablet that can speak back under laboratory light and say, yes, we meant extraterrestrial engineers, or interdimensional lords, or an ancient parallel species. The imagination rushes in where evidence thins, and once imagination begins to run, it can drag reason by the sleeve until both end up panting in the dark. So here we are. 3 rooms. In the first, myth becomes class. In the second, memory becomes hierarchy. In the third, blood becomes the secret engine of history. And perhaps the hardest truth is that parts of all 3 rooms may belong to the same house. Maybe the ancient dynasties did preserve a memory of unusual origins, then expressed that memory through sacred language, then built political systems around it, then watched later descendants continue the social structures long after the original meaning had dimmed. Maybe what began as real difference became ritualized difference, then symbolic difference, then class reproduction, while still carrying enough ancestral pride to behave like a sacred inheritance. Maybe modern elites do not know precisely what their ancient claims once meant, yet still move as if the line matters. Family offices, strategic marriages, blood-conscious circles, discreet philanthropy, trust structures, archival obsession, old names recurring in the same zones of influence. A system can survive long after its theology is forgotten. You know that feeling when you inherit a ritual in a family, and nobody remembers exactly why it began, yet everyone becomes uneasy if it is skipped. I suspect bloodline consciousness can work that way on the scale of centuries. The ancient explanation fades. The behavior remains. That may be the darkest possibility of all, because it means people can preserve power with almost religious discipline without even fully remembering the original creed that justified it. Look back now over everything we have gathered tonight. A clay prism listing kingship as something descending, not merely approved. Antediluvian rulers with mathematically structured reigns too regular to feel random. A flood remembered in text and touched in mud by archaeology. 12 post-flood dynastic lines treated as especially significant, especially preservable, especially worth carrying forward. Royal tombs whose dead received treatment far beyond ordinary status. Temple offices inherited like property. Kings claiming measurable divinity, not only favor. Marriage networks binding cities and empires. Successor powers adopting rather than erasing old legitimacy structures. Medieval houses reaching backward toward Troy and other Eastern origins. Modern elites still guarding pedigree with a care that official democratic culture pretends no longer matters. It is a long chain. Some links are iron. Some are silver. Some may only be smoke. Still, the chain has enough weight to hold in the hand. And if you ask me, the most honest conclusion is not that we know exactly what the bloodlines were, but that bloodline itself was the central technology of power for a very long time. Whether divine, social, administrative, genetic, or some blend of all four, ancestry was used as a mechanism for storing and transmitting authority across catastrophe. That phrase matters. Storing authority across catastrophe. Because states die, cities sink, religions split, languages vanish. But families, especially disciplined ones, can carry systems through ruin in a way institutions often cannot. A temple may burn. A blood-conscious household can rebuild inside the next regime. That is why conquerors married them. That is why archives preserved them. That is why later elites still treasure lineages even when they publicly claim only to value talent. Lineage is portable architecture. It lets power survive the flood. Now the fire is lower. The room is almost red at the edges. This is usually the moment in a story where the teller pretends certainty or runs toward some sharp grand finale. I do not want to do that. Nights are not for false certainty. They are for holding a question long enough that it becomes gentle. So let the question stay gentle. What if the ancient kings were lying? Then they lied with extraordinary consistency, and later societies built real institutions around those lies. What if they were encoding something symbolic? Then symbols shaped marriage, law, inheritance, and power as effectively as iron chains. What if they were preserving memory of a real superior caste or survivor group? Then the descendants of that group may still sit, quietly diluted but still traceable, inside the upper rooms of modern systems. What if they meant exactly what they said? Then, history is stranger than our public language allows, and the oldest aristocracies on Earth may have spent millennia preserving not just advantage, but essence. I cannot settle that for you. No one honest can. But perhaps that is not a weakness. Perhaps uncertainty is the only proper ending for a subject built from broken tablets, vanished cities, official genealogies, elite habits, and the very human tendency to guard inheritance as if the world might drown again tomorrow. Because in a sense, every age feels like it is waiting for its own flood. Economic collapse, war, social upheaval, revolution, technological rupture, and, in every age, the same kinds of families prepare the same way. Diversify, archive, marry carefully, keep access, preserve the children, carry forward the line. That may be ordinary prudence, or it may be the echo of a lesson first learned in the silt of ancient Mesopotamia. After waters withdrew and survivors looked around the broken world and decided that whatever kingship was, it had to be carried in certain families if order was ever to return. If you listen carefully now, you can almost hear the old scribes again. Not chanting, not preaching, simply pressing wedge marks into damp clay, one line after another, as if the future might depend on names being kept in the right order. Perhaps it did. Perhaps it still does. And as we drift toward the next part, toward the last long stretch of this night journey, we leave behind the need to choose too quickly among the three doors. Let them stand. Let them breathe. Let them trouble the edge of sleep. The prism remains. The dynasties remain in text. The bloodline logic remains in behavior. The modern world remains full of families who act as if ancestry is a vault no wise person would leave unlocked. Soon we will let the whole thread loosen into final reflection, into the softer dark where history stops arguing and begins to feel like weather over deep water. For now, just hold this. Whether kingship came from heaven, from survivors, or from story, someone believed it strongly enough to organize civilization around inherited lines. And once civilization learns to do that, it rarely forgets the method. Now, the room grows quieter, and history begins to feel less like a timeline and more like a long corridor of breathing stone. We have spent so much of this night among kings, tablets, graves, dynasties, contracts, marriages, and the patient mathematics of inherited power, that it becomes easy to forget what all of this would have felt like to the ordinary people living beneath such systems. A bloodline theory is never only a theory. It becomes a roof over daily life. It becomes tax, ritual, duty, fear, obedience, and the small, careful adjustments people make when they live near authority they believe is older than reason. Imagine a potter in a Mesopotamian city at dusk. The kiln is still warm. The river smell hangs in the evening air. Mud brick walls keep the day's heat and release it slowly. Somewhere above the roofs, A temple platform catches the last gold light. The potter does not read every line of the King List. He does not debate theoretical frameworks. He knows something simpler and heavier. The ruler belongs to a line set apart. The priests belong to lines set apart. The important marriages happen elsewhere, in rooms where names matter more than faces. He lives inside a world already arranged. And this, I think, is where the true force of bloodline enters history. Not only in palaces, but in the imaginations of those who must live around palaces. Power becomes deepest when it stops looking temporary. That is why dynasties loved genealogy. Not just because it helped them defend succession among rivals, though it did. Not just because it preserved property, though it did that too. Genealogy made power feel natural, ancient, inherited, difficult to argue with, almost geological. A family ruling for one generation can be challenged. A family ruling in a line that stretches backward into flood survivors. Divine union. And heaven descended, kingship begins to feel like weather. One does not rebel against weather lightly. You can see this instinct traveling through later centuries with eerie smoothness. A medieval noble house maintains its ancestral roles, not merely for pride, but to persuade the present that the family was always meant to occupy its place. A banking dynasty keeps marriages close to certain circles not merely for convenience, but to preserve continuity of trust and temperament. A modern political family tells stories of service, character, and inherited duty. And the language is softer now, more democratic at the edges, yet the old idea remains underneath. We are not new. We come from people fitted for this. If you were standing here with me, looking into the fire, you might say that this is simply how human hierarchy works. Perhaps so. But then we should be frank enough to admit what that means. It means that ancestry is never a decorative detail in civilization. It is one of the main machines by which civilization sorts who may command, who may inherit, who may interpret, and who must merely adapt. There is something almost tender in the way families preserve themselves. Portraits cleaned, letters tied with ribbon, rings kept in drawers, names repeated through generations, as if syllables themselves could keep a wall standing. The practice is not monstrous by default. In small households, it can be beautiful. Memory is one form of love. Yet at the scale of dynasties, memory hardens into structure. Love becomes rank. Rank becomes opportunity. Opportunity becomes power that begins before birth. And there, again, the old Mesopotamian logic returns. Before a child in such a family speaks, the line has already spoken for them. Before they choose, they are chosen. Before they understand the map, they are already standing near the center of it. This is why modern societies keep performing a little drama of innocence around inheritance. They celebrate merit while quietly sheltering lineage. They applaud openness while preserving legacy systems. They praise mobility while transmitting invisible advantage through language, expectation, education, property, and connections so old they can no longer be fully remembered. The contradiction is not accidental. It is functional. A society that openly admitted how much ancestry still matters would become harder to manage, politely. so ancestry is denied in principle and preserved in practice. That sentence alone may be enough to explain a great deal of modern life. Think of the calm, expensive confidence that seems to gather around certain people even before they have actually done very much. It is not always personal brilliance. Sometimes it is inherited ease in the presence of institutions. They know how to enter a room built by people like their grandparents. They know how to speak to editors, donors, ministers, trustees, diplomats, rectors, board members, because the codes of those rooms are not foreign to them. The rooms may have changed paint and furniture across the centuries, but the posture required inside them has not changed very much at all. This is one reason bloodline systems survive even in officially anti-aristocratic cultures. The culture can abolish titles more easily than it can abolish inheritance of bearing. And bearing is powerful. A ruler in ancient Lagash may have displayed divinity on a carved cylinder seal. A modern heir displays something quieter. Accent, schooling, networked ease, a certain unstartled relationship to power. None of this needs to be magical in order to be effective. In some ways, it is more effective because it feels so ordinary. Still, the old sacred residue refuses to vanish entirely. Even now, when family biographies are written for major houses, they often drift toward providential language, not always in overtly religious terms, but in the cadence of destiny. The ancestor who arrived at the right hour, the generation that saved the family, the intuition that proved correct, the marriage that transformed everything, the son who restored order, the daughter who secured legacy. The language may be secular, but the rhythm is liturgical. A family story wants to sound like it was guided. Perhaps all family stories do, but dynastic stories in particular hunger to feel chosen. That hunger may be one of the oldest human cravings. To believe that continuity means favor. To believe survival across catastrophe indicates worth. To believe the line did not continue by chance, but because something in it was meant to endure. Mesopotamian dynasties said this plainly. Modern elites prefer subtler phrasing. Yet if you strip away the style differences, the emotional architecture looks remarkably similar. We were preserved. We were entrusted. We carry something. The phrase "something matters." It is imprecise on purpose. It allows a family to preserve the feeling of distinction without having to define it too exactly. In one era, the something is divine blood. In another, it is breeding. In another, it is tradition. In another, it is intellectual inheritance. In another, it is leadership culture. The container changes. The precious cargo remains unnamed enough to protect. This is why evidence alone will never completely settle the matter. Even if we had 1,000 more tablets, 100 more royal tombs, 10 perfect genetic studies, the meaning would still spill beyond the edge of proof because bloodline systems operate partly in biology, partly in institutions, and partly in imagination. Their force comes from all three at once. If people believe ancestry matters, they build institutions that make ancestry matter more. If institutions preserve ancestry, then belief in its importance deepens. Biology, whether significant or not at the beginning, becomes entangled with the rest. The cycle reinforces itself. Ancient Mesopotamia may have provided one of the earliest durable templates for this. Not necessarily the only one, and not necessarily the first in absolute terms, but one of the clearest. A civilization that took record-keeping seriously, that fused divine authority with administrative order, that stored kingship in lines and lines in clay, that turned genealogy into an instrument of government. Once such a model exists, later powers do not need to copy it perfectly. They only need to inherit enough of its logic for the old frame to survive beneath new surface materials. That, I think, is exactly what happened. When the empires changed, the bloodline model traveled more easily than cities did. When languages shifted, genealogy translated well. When religions transformed, sacred ancestry found new symbols. When political systems collapsed, family networks remained flexible enough to adapt. It is almost funny in a dry, dark way. Humanity prides itself on inventing new orders, but so often it simply repaints inherited furniture and calls the room original. And perhaps we should not be too harsh about that. Human beings are not especially good at beginning from zero. We inherit. We repeat. We improvise around old bones. We call it change, and sometimes it is change. But beneath the floorboards, history keeps its older arrangements. Now let me say something careful and important. The existence of bloodline consciousness does not mean every event in history was planned by a hidden inner circle. That is the sort of thought that overheats quickly and leaves scorch marks on the mind. Reality is usually more fragmented and more mundane. Elite systems do not need omnipotent coordination to remain elite. They need only memory, mutual recognition, and the quiet tendency of advantage to seek its own continuation. That is enough. More than enough. Often, a family can lose money and keep status. A family can lose status and keep land. A family can lose land and keep archives. A family can lose archives and keep the marriage instinct. Power survives because it has many organs. This, too, is a lesson the old dynasties understood. If one city falls, the line continues elsewhere. If one temple is looted, the marriage alliance still stands. If one archive burns, another branch remembers the names. The family is a vessel designed to outlive institutions. It can shrink, migrate, convert, rename itself, and still retain enough continuity to matter again later. That is why the ancient fascination with flood survivors feels so potent. The flood story is not only about destruction. It is about transfer. Something must be carried through catastrophe. In the Mesopotamian vision, that something was kingship and the line that could host it. The waters erase the wider field, and a narrowed inheritance steps into the emptying world. In a way, this is the core fantasy of every enduring elite. If collapse comes, our family will remain one of the lines that still knows how to begin again. Perhaps that is why such families are drawn to archives, private schools, quiet property, diversified holdings, discreet alliances, and the cultivation of adaptable children. These are modern arcs, not boats of wood, but structures of continuity. And now, as we come close to the final part, the question becomes gentler and more personal. What does any of this mean for us? The listeners, the readers, the ordinary inheritors of a world we did not arrange. It means first that history is not impersonal. It is threaded through households, names, inheritances, and long family memories. Empires are built from these intimate materials more often than textbooks admit. It means, second, that skepticism should remain alive. Elite myths are not harmless. They organize opportunity. They can become invisible law. It means, third, that mystery should remain alive, too. Not every strange thing in the record should be bullied into a tidy explanation, simply because tidy explanations feel respectable. Sometimes the honest response is to say that the old texts are stranger than our modern categories allow, and that certain patterns of continuity remain difficult to explain away completely. And perhaps it means something softer still. Perhaps it means that every human being, whether born in a palace or an apartment, lives partly inside inheritances they did not choose. Some inherit vast structures. Some inherit almost nothing. Some inherit silence. Some inherit a surname that opens doors. Some inherit a debt that closes them. The difference in scale is enormous. Yes, but the principle is shared. We all arrive carrying stories that began before we did. The dynasties simply carried larger stories and defended them with greater skill. So tonight, as the fire settles and the shadows on the wall lengthen, let yourself feel the weight of that old truth without panic. The world has long been shaped by inherited lines. Some were probably exaggerated. Some were surely fabricated. Some may have preserved real ancient continuities far more faithfully than we like to admit. All of them remind us that history is never only events. It is also transmission. What survived? Who preserved it? Whose children were told the names? And whose children were not? In the next and final part, we will let the whole investigation exhale. We will gather the prism, the flood, the dynasties, the western thread, the eastern echoes, the modern houses, and the three open doors, and we will leave the question where perhaps it belongs, not solved, but glowing softly in the dark like cuneiform under museum glass. And so, at last, we come back to the prism. Not physically, of course. We are not in Oxford, beneath museum lights, with polished floors under our shoes and the hush of visitors moving around glass cases. But in the mind we are back there now, standing before that small clay object that has quietly endured empires. Religion changes. Scholarship, ridicule, fascination, war, and the slow modern habit of walking past ancient things too quickly. It is still only clay, baked earth, dry blood color in the light, a hand-sized monument to one of humanity's most dangerous ideas, that authority can be inherited not simply as office, but as essence. Someone pressed those wedge marks with confidence. Someone believed that the order of names mattered. Someone believed that if the line were not preserved, something larger than one king or one city might be lost. Across 4,000 years, that confidence still reaches us. Even now, the text does not sound embarrassed by itself. That may be what unsettles modern readers most. Ancient scribes did not write these claims as though apologizing in advance to future skeptics. They wrote as administrators of reality, Kingship descended. The flood came. Kingship descended again. The dynasties followed. It is an austere rhythm. No pleading, no flourish, just sequence. Perhaps that is why the story lingers so stubbornly. It does not ask to be admired. It simply persists. And persistence has a strange authority of its own. Tonight we traced that persistence as far as we could without slipping into fantasy or flattening everything into boredom. We saw ancient cities documenting bloodline with accountant precision. We saw royal families behaving as though ancestry were the most practical thing in the world. We saw conquerors inherit legitimacy rather than start fresh. We saw medieval houses reach backward toward Eastern origins. We saw modern elites continue to preserve network, name, education, marriage, and access in ways that feel hauntingly old. At each step, we met the same possibility, dressed differently. That power may live longest when it convinces people it is inherited from somewhere deeper than ordinary human arrangement. Sometimes that somewhere is called heaven. Sometimes it is called noble stock. Sometimes it is called old family. Sometimes it is called legacy. Sometimes it smiles and says values. But if you listen beneath the changing words, you can still hear the old current moving. We carry something. Whether the something is merely accumulated advantage, or memory of ancient migrations, or the remnant of a once more explicit sacred claim, remains uncertain. Yet uncertainty does not erase the pattern. It only asks us to handle the pattern with steadier hands. I think that is the true discipline of nights like this. Not to solve too much. Not to dismiss too quickly. To sit beside the question until it stops shouting and starts revealing its shape. And what shape has it revealed? That genealogy is one of the oldest technologies of power. That catastrophe often strengthens lineal thinking rather than weakens it. That institutions break more easily than families do. That family stories become stronger, not weaker, when tied to sacred or mythic origins. That modernity did not erase bloodline logic. It professionalized it. That elite continuity can be studied socially, historically, genetically, and symbolically all at once, because in lived reality those layers overlap. And perhaps most importantly, that people behave differently when they think their authority was given, not earned. A king who believes he stands in a divine line governs differently from a magistrate who thinks his office is temporary. A banker who thinks his family is merely fortunate behaves differently from one raised to feel his house belongs near the center of the world. A politician who believes public service is a calling inherited through generations carries himself differently from one who stumbled into office. Whether these beliefs are true in some ultimate sense is one question. Whether they shape behavior is another. The second question is easier to answer, and the answer is yes. Belief in lineage has consequences, even when lineage is partly myth. That may be the most durable lesson of all. Myths do not need to be literally true in order to organize civilization. They only need to be believed deeply enough by the people who hold institutions in their hands. Once embedded in law, marriage, property, education, and memory, a myth becomes architecture. And architecture can outlast belief. That is why fragments of ancient systems keep surviving inside later worlds that officially reject them. The theology may fade. The structure remains useful. Sacred kingship becomes hereditary aristocracy. Hereditary aristocracy becomes dynastic finance. Dynastic finance becomes elite network governance. The forms evolve. The inheritance instinct stays almost eerily constant. Still, I would not want to leave you with only suspicion. Suspicion has its place, but too much of it makes the mind brittle. Better, I think, to leave with perspective. The old dynasties were powerful. Yes, their descendants or symbolic heirs may still shape much more of modern life than many people realize. Yes, but none of this makes ordinary human life meaningless. In fact, it gives ordinary life a kind of dignity. To live outside great lineages is also to live with a different freedom. Fewer inherited rooms, fewer ancestral scripts, fewer obligations to preserve a house at all costs. History presses less heavily on some shoulders than on others, and that burden cuts both ways. Sometimes I wonder whether the children of very old families ever feel tired in private, tired of carrying dead names, tired of acting as vaults for stories they did not author, tired of marrying under the gaze of ancestors arranged in oil and varnish, tired of knowing that every failure feels not merely personal, but genealogical. Old power can be luxurious, yes, but it can also be claustrophobic. Even a gilded line is still a line. Perhaps that is why certain heirs try to flee into ordinary professions, ordinary clothes, ordinary marriages. They are not always rejecting privilege. Sometimes they are trying to escape narration. They want to become a person instead of a chapter. Ancient scribes would have found that strange. In their world, to belong to a great line was to possess meaning. Modern people are less certain. We crave inheritance and resent it at the same time. We want roots, but not chains. Continuity, but not confinement. The old dynastic world and the modern individualist world live inside us together, and they do not get along particularly well. Maybe that tension is why stories like this one keep returning. They allow us to feel, for a moment, the old architecture still standing beneath the modern floor. The prism says kingship descended. Modern architecture says everyone is equal. Lived reality whispers something in between. That whisper is where most of us actually live. And now, as the night grows gentler and thought itself starts to soften, we do not need to force a verdict. Let the three doors remain open behind us. Let the prism remain in its glass case. Let the kings stay in their clay order. Let the dynasties fade into names again. We have done enough for one night. We have followed the line from river silt and temple archives to modern surnames and quiet rooms of influence. We have watched blood become story, and story become structure, and structure become ordinary life. We have allowed the possibility that ancient people may have known something we no longer know clearly, or else believed something so intensely that belief itself shaped the whole future. Either way, the result surrounds us. The modern world did not spring up clean and new. It inherited. It married. It preserved. It forgot selectively. It remembered strategically. It still does. When you wake tomorrow and see headlines about royal houses, old fortunes, political families, banking names, private conferences, and familiar dynasties appearing again in slightly new forms, perhaps you will feel the faint presence of the older pattern beneath the surface. Not a dramatic revelation, just a quiet second layer, like old writing beneath newer ink. That is enough. History rarely hands us certainty. More often, it hands us echoes, partial records, damaged numbers, names copied and recopied until they become almost dreamlike. Yet sometimes those fragments align just enough to suggest that what we call the present is less original than it seems. A little clay prism, a flood in the mud, 12 dynasties, thousands of years, and a question that still does not sleep. Who inherits power, and why? The fire is almost down to embers now. The room has become softer at the edges. The shadows do not feel threatening anymore. Only deep. Only old. If you listen closely, you can almost hear a reed stylus pressing into wet clay, then lifting, pressing, then lifting again. Patient as rain, certain as ritual, preserving names so they might cross the dark. Let them cross. Let the question cross with them. And let yourself drift without needing to settle it tonight. Whether kingship came from heaven, or from catastrophe, or from story, the world has long been shaped by those who believed it could be carried through blood. We have followed that belief as far as we could with honesty. Now the rest belongs to sleep, to dreams, to the slow turning of thought beneath the threshold of words. The stars over ancient Sumer are still the stars above us now. The same constellations, the same dark between them, the same old human instinct to look upward and imagine that whatever governs the earth must have come from somewhere beyond the earth. Then to look downward and discover that it is settled, as so many things do, inside families, names, inheritances, and the careful memory of those who refuse to let their line be lost. Rest now. Let the dynasties recede into distance. Let the clay cool in its glass silence. Let the kings go on counting themselves without you for a while, and let the final uncertainty do what it should do. Not frighten you, but humble you a little, soothe you a little, and remind you that history is always larger, older, and stranger than the stories any one age tells about itself. Good night.